Elira was 7 years old when the Ashwood Order took her from the smoking ruins of a border village and told her the wolves had done it. She spent the next 15 years believing that lie with her whole body, trained in blade work, poison craft, and the art of disappearing into a smile, all in service of a single purpose: infiltrate the court of Cassian Vaelor, the Alpha King of Ravensmoor, and end the bloodline that had supposedly slaughtered her family. She was given a new name, a new history, and a wound she was never allowed to question: the ash-shaped burn scar on her collarbone that the Order told her came from wolf fire, and that she now knows came from something else entirely. The Order's real founder, Commander Desirel Vance, was not avenging the border village. He orchestrated its destruction himself, staging a wolf attack to justify a decades-long campaign to seize Ravensmoor's throne through a puppet queen he installed years ago. Queen Isolde, Cassian's own cousin, who believes she is owed the crown and has quietly poisoned court politics from within for a decade, waiting for someone like Elira to finish what Vance started from outside. Cassian is not the monster the Order built him into. He is a king, exhausted by a war he never wanted, holding a kingdom together through sheer will after his father's death left the throne vulnerable to exactly the kind of internal rot Isolde represents. His bond with his werewolf, Kael, is the last uncomplicated relationship in his life. The wolf trusts nothing it hasn't earned, which is why its calm reaction to Elira, even as she kneels before him holding a blade she was sent to kill him with, becomes the first crack in everything Elira believes. Cassian's wound is his own. He executed his uncle 2 years ago for treason, a man he loved, and has never forgiven himself for the doubt that still visits him at night. He recognizes something in Elira's rage that mirrors his own buried grief, and it is that recognition, not attraction alone, that stops him from killing her on the battlefield. The central contradiction: Elira was raised to destroy the one man capable of stopping the true atrocity being planned against her own people. A second, larger massacre Vance intends to stage and blame on Ravensmoor, justifying a full invasion. The people who raised her, who she has spent her life avenging herself for, are the actual monsters, and the man she was sent to kill is the only one positioned to stop them. The moon hung full and merciless over the battlefield, indifferent to the bodies it lit. Elira knelt in the mud with a sword in her hand, and someone else's blood drying on her face. Not her own, not yet. Around her, the last of the fighting sputtered into silence, steel finding sheaths, men finding their knees, the particular hush that follows slaughter when there is nothing left to kill. Smoke drifted low across the churned earth, catching the moonlight in slow grey ribbons, and somewhere behind her, a horse screamed and was quieted. She had trained 15 years for this moment. She had rehearsed it in her sleep, in the dark of the Order's stone dormitories, in the silent hours between drills when sleep wouldn't come, and the only company she'd ever known was the shape of her own purpose. The Alpha King of Ravensmoor, cornered, disarmed, the blade in her hand finding the space between his ribs before he could so much as reach for hers. A clean ending, a debt finally paid. It had not gone that way. He had let her get close. Close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the fresh cut bleeding above his temple, the way his hand had closed around her wrist, not to break it, but to still it, a grip that could have shattered bone, and chose instead to simply hold. And beside him, a wolf the size of a young bear had simply sat down, watched her, did not growl. That was the part she couldn't explain to herself yet. The wolf should have torn her apart the moment she raised her blade. Instead, it looked at her the way you look at someone you're waiting for, patient and unbothered, as if her arrival had been expected for a very long time. "You came to kill me," Cassian said. His voice was low, rough with the night's violence, but there was no fear in it, only a terrible, patient curiosity. The voice of a man asking a question he already half suspected the answer to. "Why haven't you tried again?" She hadn't lowered the sword. She had turned it, offered the hilt to him instead of the blade to herself, some instinct overriding 15 years of training. In a single, unbearable second, she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. Her arms shook with the effort of the gesture, muscle memory screaming at her to finish what she'd started. Behind him, a man in dark armor was already shouting for her execution. She recognized the voice before she recognized the face. Commander Vance, pointing, always pointing, directing the world like pieces on a board even here, even now, on a field littered with the dead he had helped make. "Kill her!" Vance called, his tone carrying easily over the dying sounds of battle. "She is order-trained. She will not stop. She cannot be trusted to kneel." But Cassian did not move to kill her. He crouched instead, bringing himself level with her eyes, close enough that she could smell blood and wood smoke on him, and something in his stillness undid a knot in her chest she hadn't known was tied. "The wolves murdered my village," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded, how much like a child's it had become without her permission. "When I was 7, I watched the fire take my mother's house from the tree line. I have spent every year since learning how to make you pay for it." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, recognition, the look of a man encountering a story he already knew the shape of, and hated the shape of, the way you hate a lie you've heard told about yourself too many times to count. "We didn't burn any village that year," he said quietly. "Not one, in 15 years, near the southern border. I would know. I was there for every campaign my father waged, and every one after. I keep the record of every life this kingdom has taken, because a king who doesn't count the cost isn't fit to spend it. There is no border village in that record. There never has been. It should have meant nothing. A stranger's claim, offered on a battlefield, with every incentive in the world to lie his way out of a blade. But something in the flat, unhurried way he said it. No defensiveness, no performance of innocence. Just a tired man, reciting a fact he'd apparently had to defend before, lodged itself somewhere she couldn't immediately dislodge. She wanted to call him a liar. The word was already forming, already climbing toward her tongue with the ease of 15 years of certainty behind it. But behind him, the crowned woman, watching from the ridge, Queen Isolde, still and pale in the moonlight, her gown untouched by the mud and blood that painted everyone else on that field, did not look surprised by the accusation. She looked bored by it, the particular boredom of someone who has heard a lie rehearsed too many times to feel anything about it anymore. Elira's hand, still holding the offered sword, began to shake. Cassian took the sword from her palm, not as a captor claiming a trophy, but carefully, the way a man takes something fragile from someone who might drop it and hurt themselves on the falling. His fingers brushed hers for half a second, and she flinched, and he did not react to the flinch at all, as if he understood exactly what it meant, and refused to make her feel small for it. "You're not a prisoner," he said, loud enough for Vance and the watching soldiers to hear, his voice carrying the particular weight of a king making a decision he knew would be unpopular. "You're a guest of Ravensmoor. Until I understand why the Ashwood Order sent a child they raised into a weapon to die on my sword tonight." Vance's jaw tightened. For the first time, something like alarm crossed his composed face, gone as quickly as it came, smoothed back into that terrible calm. But Elira saw it, filed it away, the way she'd been trained to file away every crack in an enemy's mask, every tell that meant more than the words spoken over it. Except she no longer knew, kneeling in the mud between a king she was sent to kill and a commander who had raised her from ash, which one of them was actually the enemy she should be watching. The wolf pressed its head briefly against Cassian's knee, eyes never leaving her face, waiting, still, as if it already knew something she didn't, and was simply giving her the time to catch up to it. They took her through the gates of Ravensmoor under guard, but not in chains. She noted that. Filed it too, alongside every other small contradiction that refused to fit the shape of the story she'd been told her entire life. A story that was beginning, for the first time, to feel less like memory and more like something worn thin from repetition, a groove, carved so deep she'd mistaken it for bedrock. The road into the castle wound past homes still lit from within at that late hour, ordinary windows glowing amber against the dark, children's laughter drifting faintly from somewhere she couldn't see. She had expected silence. She had expected the particular quiet of a people cowed into obedience, the kind the Order's instructors had described so vividly in her childhood lessons that she could still hear their voices reciting it. Instead, she heard a lute somewhere, badly played, and someone laughing at the mistake rather than punishing it. Behind her, the fires on the horizon continued to burn, and she did not yet know how many of them Vance himself had lit, how many years of careful, patient cruelty had gone into making sure she would never think to ask. The castle was nothing like the Order's briefings had described it. She had expected iron and cruelty, walls built to intimidate, a throne room designed to remind every visitor of their smallness the moment they crossed the threshold. Instead, she found warm firelight in wide stone halls, wolf crest banners weathered from years of actual use rather than ceremony, their gold thread dulled by smoke and time rather than freshly gilded for show. And, strangest of all, people, servants who met her eyes without flinching, guards who spoke to each other like men who trusted their king rather than feared him, trading easy jokes in the corridors as though this were simply a place where they lived, not a fortress built to terrorize the kingdoms beyond it. She was given a room, not a cell, a wash basin, not shackles, a window that opened, unlocked, onto a courtyard she could have escaped through a dozen different ways if escape had still been the thing she wanted, if any part of her still trusted the certainty that had marched her onto that battlefield in the first place. It unsettled her more than violence would have. Violence, at least, she understood. This quiet, deliberate humanity was a language she had never been taught to read. On the second night, Cassian came to her himself, without guards, and sat across a small table, as though this were an ordinary conversation between ordinary people, rather than a king alone in a room with the weapon sent to kill him. "Tell me about the fire," he said, "the one that took your village." She told him the story she had told herself for 15 years. The version burned so deep into her that it no longer felt like memory, only truth, worn smooth by 15 years of retelling, until every rough edge of doubt had been sanded away. Wolves in the dark. Her mother's scream, cut short. The scar on her collarbone, shaped like ash, that the Order told her came from wolf fire the night she was orphaned and left for dead among the ruins. He listened without interrupting, without the small performances of sympathy she'd expected. No reaching for her hand, no practiced softness in his face. Just attention, complete and unhurried, the kind she'd rarely been given by anyone in her life. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and the fire in the hearth popped and settled between them. "I executed my uncle 2 years ago," he said finally, "for treason. He was the last family I had left besides my father, and I signed the order myself. And some nights, I still don't know if I did it because it was justice, or because I was afraid of what it meant to let him live and be wrong about him. I have never told anyone that. Not my council, not Kael, though I suspect he already knows." His hand moved, briefly, to the dagger at his belt, an old, war-forged blade she'd noticed before, but never asked about. He didn't draw it. He rarely seemed to. It simply stayed there, worn smooth at the hilt from years of being touched and never used, a habit she suspected he wasn't even aware of anymore. It was not comfort. It was not an argument against her story, not a clever rebuttal built to dismantle her certainty piece by piece. It was simply a wound, laid beside her own, unadorned, asking nothing of her, except to be witnessed the way she had just asked to be witnessed herself. She realized, watching the firelight move across his tired face, that she had spent 15 years imagining this man as something closer to a weather pattern than a person, an inevitability, a force to be endured or destroyed, never someone who might sit across a table at midnight and admit to doubting himself. It was a small realization, almost embarrassingly simple, but it sat heavy in her chest all the same. The first crack in a wall she had built so early in her life, she'd forgotten it was a wall at all. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, and heard the suspicion in her own voice, even as some other, quieter part of her leaned toward the honesty of it. "Because you're looking at me like I'm a monster you've spent your whole life preparing to kill," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a tired kind of clarity. "And I recognize that look. I've worn it myself, in a mirror, more nights than I'd like to admit. It's a particular kind of loneliness, wearing a purpose someone else built for you, and calling it your own reflection." She began attending court sessions after that, not as a prisoner observing her captor, but because she found she could not stop watching, could not look away from the slow accumulation of evidence that nothing about this kingdom matched the shape the Order had poured into her since childhood. A farmer's grievance over flooded fields, heard in full, resolved before sundown, with compensation drawn from the Crown's own stores. A pact dispute, settled not by decree, but by making both sides speak, until they ran out of grievance, and found, exhausted, some fragile agreement waiting underneath it. A wolf shifter accused of theft, given the chance to explain himself before judgment, and pardoned when the truth turned out kinder than the accusation. Nothing about it matched the tyranny the Order had spent her childhood describing in patient, careful detail, lesson after lesson, until tyranny had simply become another word for wolf. She caught herself one evening, laughing at something a young guard said in the mess hall, an unguarded, unrehearsed sound she didn't recognize as her own, foreign in her throat, startling enough that she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, as if she could take it back. She began, too, to notice the small architecture of a kingdom that governed itself, rather than one that simply survived under a king's mood. A council of elders from the outlying villages met with Cassian twice a week, their complaints heard in full, even when they were tedious, even when they concerned nothing grander than a disputed fence line or a miller's unfair prices. She watched him listen to an old woman describe a leaking roof for nearly 10 minutes without once looking impatient, and something in her chest ached at the sight of it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so plainly, unremarkably ordinary, the kind of decency she had never once been taught to expect from the enemy she'd been raised to destroy. That night, alone in the room that was not a cell, she pressed her palm against the scar on her collarbone and, for the first time in 15 years, let herself wonder, quietly, terrifyingly, if it was lying to her the same way everything else seemed to be. Outside her window, the moon was waning now, less full than it had been the night she knelt in the mud with a sword in her hand, and she found herself grateful for the smaller light. It asked less of her. It did not demand she see everything all at once. "I want to pause here for a moment and just say thank you, genuinely, for sitting with Elira this long. If a story like this one, about finding truth underneath everything you were once told to believe, means something to you tonight, staying subscribed means we get to keep building worlds like this together, one story at a time." The record room was not meant for her eyes. She found it by accident, searching for something else entirely, a supply ledger, to explain why Ravensmoor's grain stores looked nothing like the famine the Order swore this kingdom was starving its people into, a discrepancy she'd noticed and couldn't let go of, the old instinct to verify everything before trusting it. Instead, she found a name she recognized, her own village. dated 15 years back, filed not under Ravensmoor's military logs, where an attack of that scale would have been recorded in detail, but cross-referenced in a private order communication, smuggled loose between two unrelated pages, as if someone once had needed it hidden but hadn't quite dared destroy it, a small act of conscience buried where only chance would ever uncover it. Operation conducted. Border village pacified. Casualties acceptable. Subject selected for future placement. Resemblance confirmed. No wolves. No mention of Ravensmoor at all. Just cold administrative language, describing the end of everything she had ever called home. Filed away with the same bureaucratic indifference the order applied to supply requisitions and training schedules, as if a village and a shipment of grain belonged in the same ledger. Her hands went cold before her mind caught up to what she was reading. Subject selected. Her. Chosen. Not orphaned by tragedy, but harvested from it. Cultivated the way a farmer chooses a seed for a specific soil. Shaped, deliberately, by a resemblance to some woman she'd never known. Some old grievance of Vance's that had nothing to do with wolves, or justice, or vengeance at all, and everything to do with a plan, laid years before she was old enough to understand she was living inside it. The scar on her collarbone was not wolf fire, it was order-made, a brand disguised as a wound, so that every time she touched it, and she had touched it 1,000 times, in 1,000 quiet moments of grief she'd believed were hers, she would remember a lie as though it were her own flesh, would carry the order's purpose stitched into her own skin, and mistake it for scar tissue grown from loss. She sat on the cold floor of the record room for a long time, the paper shaking in her hands, and felt the entire architecture of herself, 15 years of purpose, grief, identity, every private conviction she'd built her life upon, collapse quietly into something she no longer recognized as hers. There was no dramatic shattering, just a slow, terrible unspooling, thread by thread, until she was sitting in the wreckage of a person who had never actually existed. When Cassian found her there near dawn, drawn by a servant's worried report of candlelight burning too long in an unused wing, he did not ask what was wrong. He simply sat down on the floor beside her, in his own castle, in front of his own record room, still dressed in the previous day's clothes, and waited until she was ready to speak. "They made me," she whispered, the words coming apart in her mouth. "Everything I am, they built it. Even my grief. Even this." Her hand went to the scar, pressing hard enough to hurt, as if she could press the truth back out through her skin. "I don't know what's actually mine anymore. I don't know if anything ever was. This is," he said, and reached, not to touch the scar, not to offer the kind of comfort that smooths over pain before it's finished being felt, but to still her shaking hand against her own chest, letting her feel her own heartbeat under her palm. "Whatever they made you to be, this, right now, sitting here on a cold floor at dawn, choosing to feel this instead of running from it, that's not order work. They couldn't have built this. This is you deciding, in real time, to survive the truth instead of the lie. That decision is yours. No one gave it to you." She did not answer him. She didn't have words yet for what she was feeling, some current still too raw to name. But she let her hand stay where he'd placed it, feeling her own pulse beneath her fingers, steady and undeniably real, in a way nothing else in her life had been in 15 years. And for the first time since she was 7 years old, she let herself cry, without immediately asking whether the grief belonged to her. Later, when the worst of it had passed, she asked him the question she'd been afraid to ask, since she'd first read the document. If none of it was real, the village, the wolves, even this scar, then who am I supposed to be now? What's left, once you take away everything I built myself around? Cassian considered this for a long moment before answering, choosing his words with the same care he brought to a council dispute. I don't think that's a question anyone else can answer for you, he said. Not the Order, and not me either. No matter how much easier it would be if one of us could just hand you a new purpose, the way they handed you the old one. But I don't think you're nothing, Elira. I think you're someone who spent 15 years being extraordinarily good at surviving a lie. That skill doesn't disappear just because the lie did. It just needs somewhere honest to go. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Ravensmoor, indifferent and patient, the way mornings always are toward the wreckage the night leaves behind. It took her 3 more days to find the second document, hidden deeper this time, coded in a hand she recognized, with a cold jolt of recognition, as Isolde's own, the elegant, deliberate handwriting she'd seen on court decrees and formal correspondence a dozen times without ever suspecting it. A letter, unfinished, unsent, but damning in every line that existed. Isolde, writing to Vance, confirming a date, confirming access to the peace summit, the guest lists, the layout of the hall, confirming that when the wolf attack came this time, she would ensure the king's personal guard was thinned enough to make it convincing, reassigned on some pretext, some administrative excuse, no one would think to question until it was already too late to matter. Elira read it twice, to be certain she wasn't inventing the shape of her own fear, tracing each line with her finger, as if touch could confirm what her eyes refused to fully believe. Isolde's handwriting was precise, almost delicate, entirely at odds with the violence it described so plainly, as though betrayal, written carefully enough, could be mistaken for correspondence between friends. Elira had spent enough years reading coded intentions in careful language to recognize exactly what she was looking at. She had no reason to bring this to Cassian. She was not his subject, not his ally, not truly, a guest who had not yet earned trust, a woman raised by the very organization now plotting his death, and she understood exactly how this would look from the outside. If she showed him this and he didn't believe her, she would be executed as a spy who'd overplayed her hand, a final order operative caught manufacturing chaos in the last act of a long game. If she stayed silent, she would be exactly what the Order had built her to be, a weapon that let the kill happen and called silence obedience, called cowardice survival. She thought of the wolf that hadn't torn her apart on a battlefield weeks ago, patient and waiting for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. She thought of a king who had told her the truth about his own guilt instead of using her grief against her, who had chosen mercy before he had any evidence that mercy was deserved. She thought of the scar that was never a wound from an enemy. It was a brand from the very people she'd trusted her entire life, the people she'd have died defending only weeks ago. She went to him anyway, the letter folded tight in her fist, the entire walk to his chambers, her heartbeat loud enough that she could hear it over her own footsteps. "If I'm wrong about this," she said, laying the letter on his table, with hands that would not stop shaking, "you'll have every reason to believe I was sent to manufacture a lie that turns you against your own family. One final order maneuver, dressed up as loyalty. I understand that risk completely. Read it anyway, please." Cassian read it in silence, his face unreadable at first, then slowly, unmistakably, going the color of ash as the meaning settled in. "Isolde," he said, not a question. A grief already arriving, already familiar with the shape of betrayal from family, having lived through this particular wound once before with his uncle. "I have no proof beyond this letter," Elira said, forcing herself to hold his gaze, even as everything in her wanted to look away. "No reason for you to trust a woman the Order built specifically to deceive people like you. But I'm telling you the truth, and I need you to choose to believe it anyway, the same way you chose to believe I was worth sparing before you had any evidence of that either." He looked at her for a long moment, the same stillness she'd first seen on the battlefield, the mercy that had spared her life before he had any reason to extend it, now turned toward a decision that would cost him something no matter which way it fell.
"I do," he said finally.
Not because of the letter, because of you. Because you didn't have to bring this to me, and you did anyway, knowing exactly what it might cost you. They spent the rest of that night, and the following day, planning quietly, trusting almost no one else, with the full shape of what they knew. Cassian could not simply cancel the summit without revealing his suspicions and warning Isolde she'd been discovered, giving her and Vance time to disappear or accelerate their plans into something even less predictable. Instead, he chose to let the trap close on schedule, reinforcing the guard in ways subtle enough not to alert anyone watching for exactly that kind of correction, while Elira catalogued every detail of the letter against the summit's layout, searching for the precise moment the attack was most likely to begin. "You don't have to be there," Cassian told her, the night before, as they stood together over a map of the summit hall spread between them, like the last honest thing left in the room. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already done more than anyone could have reasonably asked of you." "I know I don't have to be," she said. "I'm choosing to be. There's a difference, and I need you to understand. It's not the same thing the Order ever gave me." The summit was 2 days away. There was no time left to be careful, and no time left to be anything other than certain. The Peace Summit Hall was lit gold with 100 candles. Banners of both kingdoms hung side by side, in a fragile symbol of the truce Cassian had spent years building toward. The truce Vance intended to burn to the ground in a single night, and blame on wolves who had never wanted this war in the first place. Silk and steel mingled in the crowd, delegates from both sides exchanging careful pleasantries over wine, none of them aware they were standing inside the last calm hour before everything changed. Elira felt it before she saw it. The wrongness in the guard rotation, thinned exactly as Isolde had promised. Familiar faces missing from posts they should have held, reassigned on paperwork no one had thought twice about signing. She caught Cassian's eye across the hall and didn't need words. He was already moving, already reaching for the blade at his hip beneath the ceremonial cloak he wore for the occasion. Vance's men came through the servants' passage first, disguised in Ravensmoor colors, blades already drawn for a massacre they intended to dress as a wolf uprising by morning. A story that would have traveled faster than truth ever could, that would have justified exactly the war Vance had spent 15 years engineering from the shadows. Elira met the first of them with a speed the Order had built into her own body, years of training turning finally, completely, against the hand that had shaped it for a very different purpose. Kael was a blur of gold-eyed fury at Cassian's side, tearing through the chaos with a ferocity that made even seasoned soldiers step back. And for the first time, Elira understood what she'd sensed in the wolf's calm that first night on the battlefield. It had never doubted her. It had been waiting, patiently, for her to stop doubting herself. Screams rose through the hall as guests scattered, tables overturning, candles guttering out in the sudden violent wind of bodies moving too fast through too small a space. Somewhere behind her, Isolde's voice rose in a performance of horror that didn't quite reach her eyes. She found Vance near the dais, calm even now, always calm, already reaching for Cassian's exposed back with a blade meant to look, in the morning's telling, like a wolf's claim, rather than a man's betrayal. "You made me into this," Elira said, closing the distance between them, before he could complete the strike, her sword already rising to meet his. "So use it. I'm still the weapon you built. I just chose who I'm pointed at." Something almost like respect flickered across Vance's face, brief and unfamiliar, on features trained never to betray anything at all. The first genuine emotion she'd ever seen from him in 15 years of quiet observation. "You were always going to be my finest work," he said, parrying her first strike with practiced ease. "It's a shame you turned out to have a conscience. I thought I'd trained that out of you years ago." "You trained me to survive," she said, pressing forward, forcing him back a step toward the dais steps. "You never once trained me to stop asking why." The fight that followed was short and brutal, and entirely unlike the vengeance she'd rehearsed for 15 years in the quiet dark of the Order's dormitories, because there was no vengeance in it at all, only truth, finally allowed to defend itself with the same precision it had once been forced to attack with. Vance was skilled, cold, economical in every motion, but he had trained her himself, had built every technique she now used against him, and there is a particular vulnerability in fighting your own creation when it has finally learned to want something you never intended it to want. Vance did not survive the night. Isolde did, dragged from her chambers in chains before she could slip away through the confusion she'd helped engineer, weeping not for what she'd done, but for having been caught, for the plan collapsing one careful thread at a time in front of the entire court she'd hoped to rule. Cassian, standing over his own cousin's ruin in the wreckage of the summit hall, smoke and spilled wine mixing on the marble floor, drew the dagger he had carried unused since his uncle's execution, the blade Elira had watched him touch 100 times since and never once unsheathe. He did not use it to end her. He cut her bindings loose enough to stand for trial, not death, the same mercy that had spared Elira's life on a battlefield weeks before, held even now, even here, in front of advisors already shouting for a swifter, more permanent justice. At a cost he chose to pay in political capital rather than blood. Justice, he told them, his voice carrying clearly over the ruined hall, steady in a way that silenced even his angriest counselors. Not fear. I choose it again, the same as I should have chosen it 2 years ago, and I will not let this night convince me that mercy was ever the mistake. The hall itself took weeks to fully repair. Scorched tapestries replaced, cracked marble reset. The particular smell of smoke and spilled wine, aired out of the stone by open windows and patient time. Cassian insisted on overseeing part of the restoration himself, working alongside the craftsmen some mornings, as if rebuilding the room with his own hands might settle something in him that words alone couldn't reach. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom settled into something quieter than peace, but sturdier than the war it had narrowly avoided. Isolde's trial stretched across a bitter winter, her testimony unraveling the last remaining threads of the Order's network within Ravensmoor's own walls, exposing informants and sympathizers who had spent years working quietly against a king they'd sworn to serve. The Order itself, stripped of its commander and its inside access, fractured into smaller, weaker cells, diminished, though Elira knew better than to believe it entirely destroyed. Some lies take generations to fully starve. Elira did not become a queen, crowned by rescue, and she was careful, in those early weeks, to make sure everyone around her understood the distinction. She became something she chose for herself instead, a bridge between the border villages the Order had manipulated for a generation and the kingdom she'd once been sent to destroy, using the only inheritance the Order had ever truly given her, the ability to see through a lie before it finished forming, to recognize manipulation in its earliest, quietest stages, before it had the chance to calcify into another person's certainty. The scar remained on her collarbone. She stopped hiding it beneath high collars and careful angles. Let it show plainly, a mark she had reclaimed the meaning of, even if she couldn't erase its origin. Cassian found her on the same battlefield, months later, the grass finally growing back over the ash in soft green patches, the scorched earth healing the way earth eventually does, when given enough time and enough rain. Kael settled at their feet, at peace the way he'd never quite been before, his golden eyes half closed in the warm afternoon sun. "I chose you," she told him, watching the wind move through the new grass, "but only after I finally chose myself. I needed you to understand that order, or none of this means what I need it to mean." He didn't answer with words. He offered her a sword instead, not surrender this time, and not a captor's trophy either. Trust, returned to the hand that had once offered it to him first, on this same ground, beneath a different moon. If you stayed with me until this ending, thank you. Truly, from one storyteller to another. Stories like Elira's are the entire reason this channel exists. And if you'd like to keep walking into worlds like this one together, subscribing means you'll be here for whatever comes next.